So today's session really is about climate change, and we've titled it Climate Change 101. Now, the reason for that is because we're saying climate change isn't just something children should learn at school. And it isn't just something children should hear about in the news. Whether we like it or not, it's something that children encounter increasingly in everyday life. Children, young people, adults, families, all of us are confronted with climate change, either actively involved in it or just passively. We hear about it. So, this is our attempt as Afrikaners to bring together panelists, but also parents and people from across various parts of the country, and I would say various parts of the world as well, to have a very genuine conversation about what climate change means, especially from the perspective of families and parents, so that it's not just something that is abstract, but it's something that we feel we have enough information to understand, first of all, understand what is happening, why it is happening, acknowledge how it is affecting us, and then moving on from that, understand how we can empower parents, families, children, young people to do something about it. Because we think that if people feel empowered to do something about it, then chances are that they feel better. But if they feel hopeless and helpless about it, then chances are that it becomes even worse than it really is. So this is our attempt to build capacity around climate change and also build awareness and drive action towards resilience and climate action. And so for me, my name is Betty Obani. I'm the Afrikiners parenting lead, and this webinar is brought to you by the parent team of Afrikiners, but working closely, of course, with the other teams within Afrikiners. So we have the research team, we have the education team, and we also have the comms team. So we have other departmental teams within Afrikiners, and we're all working together to bring this to you. Welcome. I see someone from Bolivia. Welcome. But I wear other hats as well. So beyond my association with Afrikaners, I also work on climate change issues as a researcher. So I teach climate change law and policy, and I do research around climate change and governance. And as a town councillor, I chair a committee that's on climate emergency and environment as well. So you see, I almost live, breathe, and do climate change in my everyday. So it's something I'm really passionate about, and I'm very glad and delighted that I have a brilliant team of panelists who are also working on various issues that are really centered on climate change, and they'll be happy to share with us their experiences this evening. So I'll start with Abimbola. Abimbola is one of our panelists here today. Abimbola is the founder of Revamp Rave Network, and that network is really focused on driving climate action. Abimbola has done a lot of work around building capacity for youths, for young people, and for women in coastal communities, especially low-income coastal communities, in order to improve conservation methods, to improve climate policy formulation and environmental protection for sustainability. Through her network, she's trained 800 youths. That's not a small number. 800 youths, and she's mobilized 500 women. And she's also developed a book called Ecologue that's designed to help foster climate knowledge while influencing relevant climate projects in order to solve the climate crisis in Africa. She's also worked as the chair of the EU Youth Board on Digital and Green Economy, and she's also been the national consultant for the UNODC, where she's shaping environmental sustainability efforts. Thank you for being here, Abimbola. We're really delighted to have you.
You're welcome. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. So we also have with us Martin Flynn. Martin works with voluntary action leads, specifically within the climate action project as part of the management of Climate Action Leads Partnership. In his role, Martin ensures that Climate Action Leads engages with as many people across Leads as possible in order to learn from diverse perspectives and current works in communities and potential collaborations. Thanks, Martin, for reaching out to Afrikiners and for being here as well. We're really delighted to have you.
No, thanks for inviting me. It's really good to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. And we also have with us Katie, Councillor Katie Dye, who's a councillor with Leeds City Council. Katie has over 30 years experience in teaching science, and she's always been a keen advocate for the need to look after our planet. The developing climate and ecological crisis was always a big part of her work whilst working in schools, and even since being elected to represent Killingbeck and Seacrofts, the ward where she was born in and lives in, she's also been very actively involved in climate action. It's been a great privilege for her to raise awareness around climate change, and it's been a priority for her right from the start of her career. And currently, Katie chairs the council's, that's Leeds City Council's Climate Emergency Advisory Committee, and is also the co-chair of the Leeds Climate Commission. Thanks for being here, Katie.
Thank you. It's really good to be online with everybody. Great to see so many people here.
Thank you. So we've still got people introducing themselves in the chats. Please feel free to keep doing that. We're really delighted to have you here with us. And we also have people putting in some comments in the Q&A. Thanks for that. But we'll suggest that you use the Q&A just for the questions so that we can pick that up as we go along. So we have some questions I'd like us to start off with. And this conversation is going to be in 3 parts. So the first part would be about understanding what exactly is climate change. There's some terms we hear all the time: greenhouse gases, adaptation, mitigation. What do all of these things mean? So we'll start from that, and then we'll move on to what the impacts are, and then we'll talk about actions and resources which you can share from your various organizations in terms of the experiences you've had working on climate change issues. So without further ado, to start with the background and underlying factors, let's have a moment to think about what exactly climate change means. And I would like you to approach this from a very basic, simple context, something that we can all relate with, because we have a diversity of groups represented in the audience. We have people joining from different countries. We have people who I suppose would also be at different levels in terms of their understanding of what climate change is. So in really very simple terms, what is climate change? And is it the same thing as global warming? Maybe I'll start with you, Katie.
Thank you. So climate change is a phrase really that sums up the long-term changes that are happening in global weather patterns across the globe. So that might be temperature changes, it might be rainfall, it might be wind patterns, and all of that, it comes under the umbrella term climate change. It isn't exactly the same as global warming, because global warming is simply describing the rise in temperatures. So the planet warms up and then the climate changes because of that.
Thank you very much for that, Katie. I'm just wondering, Martin, would you want to add anything to that?
I think Katie covered the distinction really nicely. I think it's just a good point that you raised, and this is something that we've found and trying to do as well as we can on within our project, that climate change is a topic that is covered a lot in the news, at school, just in the media as well. And it can often be attached to lots of different specifics. So like Katie gave some examples there of the types of ways in which it can be evident, in temperatures or rainfall, floods, but there's lots of different events that might come under or be positioned under the term of climate change. And I think that obviously we're lucky to have people from all over the world on the call today, and sort of their experience of that is probably going to vary depending on where they live. And as you said, there's going to be some really knowledgeable people on the call as well. I think sometimes when we're having these conversations, we try and remember that the kind of language side of it is important as well in terms of people's understanding, and trying to ensure that we're not excluding people from those discussions, because people might have a lot of knowledge to give. They maybe just haven't associated the same vocabulary with it as is sometimes used to talk about those topics. That's why I think it's really good what you're doing here today, because I think that's obviously a part of the angle that you're coming at it from. So I think, just that language part of it is interesting as well.
Thank you very much. And I mean, the reason I've asked this question is, and thanks for the clarification you've provided, it's, when people used to ask, well, you say there's climate change as global warming, but how come it's getting colder where I live? Or how come it's getting flooded? How come it's not hot? And then some people will say, oh, it's actually very hot. So I think just the point you've made, Martin, about how the different people on the call in different places, and they might be experiencing the same thing, but in different ways. So the rise in temperature, for instance, could result in the glaciers melting, so the ice caps melting and then leading to flooding. So there could be very different experiences, but it's all linked to this phenomenon of climate change. Thanks for that. Abimbola, would you like to weigh in and maybe tell us why this is an important issue?
Okay. So climate change, global warming, they are both very important, right? And as the other guest has said, Martin and Haiti, climate change is just a natural. The climate is a natural phenomenon where we have different types of weather patterns in terms of rainfall, in terms of sunrise, in terms of, the cold weather. However, when it gets too excessive, that's where the problem comes from, and which is caused by the planet warming at a faster pace that it shouldn't be due to greenhouse gas emissions at various levels. So I'll just like to touch on that a bit. Then I'll talk about why it's important and why it's relevant for each and every single one of us to understand the two concepts. One, two, to understand how we play a role, and three, to understand why it is important for us to take action at the various levels that we are. So when we talk about global warming, right, many people always mix the concept up, because when you hear climate change, they see it as a different concept. When they hear global warming, they see both of them as the same concept, but they're two different concepts entirely. While one triggers the other, it's like it shows the ripple effect where we get to feel it in our environment, right? So in some place you see that the weather there is like cold than it should be, and the other parts of the world you see that the weather is more hot than it should be, which is something people are experiencing and they do not understand it. And it's going down to the level of even our farmers getting to understand that they don't understand the weather patterns anymore. It's beginning to affect food security. Our water is beginning to have less straining water sources and resources, and also down to the various levels of the basic needs that needs to elevate our dignity of our person as humans. So what is global warming, right? In simple terms, not to be too technical because of the various guests that we have, I would like to explain it as we have the earth, then we have a blanket over the earth. The blanket we have over the earth, that's where we have the stores of the various gases that goes out. So whatever activities we do on the planet, it goes up to the atmosphere in terms of burning fossil fuel, in terms of conducting various agricultural activities, and also every other thing that is powered by fossil fuel, natural gas, coal. Industrial activities, manufacturing activities, production activities, right? And also the oil and gas sector, the transportation sector, and all other sector that depends on fossil fuel, as it were. So these blankets that I like to call the atmosphere stores in gases and releases these gases in the atmosphere. That's for the ones that we do not need, and has a way of regulating that and bring the required amount of energy in terms of nitrogen, methane, oxygen, carbon that we need or the planet needs. And so when it comes down to the planet, the first place it hits is the ocean. And that's why we have 60% of the world ocean covering Earth, and we have the remaining 70-30 covering the land area where the human lives, right? And these oceans are distributed across the world. It hits the planet first, gives the required nutrients, the required energy that the ocean needs to perform its own work with all other lives beneath the planet. That's where we get our fishes, that's where we get our other resources. And then our own activities as well. Once we burn fuel, do our production activities, we also emit gases, right? And where the gas goes up to the atmosphere, there's no place where it could release itself. And so it gets stored in the cloud. And that's where we get to see changes in the weather patterns, right? In simple terms. So that's where we get global warming. And global warming might not necessarily, because people keep mixing it as well. Global warming can be either the planet is too hot or too cold. However, that's why we have governmental bodies and scientific bodies in place to help us keep checking to ensure that these measurements, these researches are done to ensure that we are taking things slow at the pace that we should, not to trigger other planetary environmental realities, which we are already experiencing and seeing. And one of this body is the ICCC, which is the scientific body for the UNFCCC. So to cut this entire process off, it's important that we understand the distinction, right? If we do not have night and day, then we do not have time. If we do not have rainfall, sunlight, then we wouldn't get the required oxygen that we need through the plants, to the various other, living organisms that we have. And if we do not have other circulatives such as methane helping to power the various planetary aspects that needs to power, would have issues. So now for we, learning this distinction is important because it helps us understand how it affects us individually. And that's where the confusion sometimes comes from. How does this affect me? It affects every single one of us because no matter what you do, based on your domestic activities, whether you're cooking, whether you're leaving your lights on, whether you're jumping the bus, whether you have 4 to 5 cars in your house, some of these things add up. And that's where we have carbon footprint. How are you measuring your carbon footprint? And that's where individual action comes from. So it is important that each person understands this so they know where they are contributing. No matter how small, you're still contributing. And carbon dioxide is like the largest gas in the atmosphere, and it's too excessive for us, right? And so it's not just about carbon. We also have methane, which is 4 times more than carbon. However, it's on a smaller part, right? Amount, rather. So for us individuals, this is where we can measure ourselves and understand where our activities play a huge role. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Abimbola. And in fact, you have even taken us to the next question I was going to ask, which is around the gases. So what are the greenhouse gases? And I think you've mentioned some of them already. So you've talked about methane, you've talked about carbon, you've mentioned nitrogen. Martin, is there something else you'd want to add to that in terms of what are some of the common factors leading to climate change and what are some of those greenhouse gases that we need to be aware of?
I think, Abimbola had covered it in detail there. I think that it's just always interesting and worthwhile making the distinction between some of those greenhouse gases, and Abimbola described some of the processes. So some of those things happen on an industrial scale. So that might be how electricity is generated to power, the lights in office buildings, or it might be how we're fueling our cars using petrol or diesel. And clearly those choices are taken as an individual level, like Abimbola said, in terms of what we are able to do in our personal lives, whether that's choosing to use public transport or drive, whether that is choosing to choose to eat a certain way in terms of diets which are very high in meat, particularly red meat, tend to have a bigger impact on the climate, for reasons which we can discuss in more detail later on if we want. But I think also there's that recognition that some of these issues need to be solved as well by much bigger decisions taken at government level, both at national level within individual countries and also with countries working together. So I think, and this is maybe particularly relevant for our call, and I think we're going to come on to this later, but for conversations with children, sometimes that topic of climate change can sound massive, and it is massive, but equally for a child or a young person, they might be thinking, well, if the government or if massive supermarkets or if huge car companies don't seem to be taking that much action on this, then what am I supposed to do as a 10-year-old or, as a 15-year-old? So I think, it's always worth having that discussion and conversation and that awareness of the link between personal choice, but also between our opportunity as individuals to try and push those bigger structures, whether it's how we choose to vote or how we choose to share messages on social media or speak to family and friends, or even things maybe about choosing, if we're able to, where we can make purchases or buy certain stuff, voting with our wallets, I suppose. That's an option as well. And I think, again, there's that question of how accessible that is, because, we often hear maybe in conversations about climate change that it would be great if everybody drove electric cars, but obviously still for the majority of people, if you have a car, you might not be able to afford an electric car, and lots of people don't have a car. So it's all the different levels at which people can influence things, also at which their own personal circumstances mean that they are actually able to influence things or in a position to do that.
No, thank you very much, Martin. And I think the point you just made about how everyone's in a different space or different context, and I think we have to be kind to each other and understand that we can't all take the same action. But part of the conversation this evening is to say, well, what can we do? I think everybody can do something, but it might be something different compared to what the next person can do. So no one's absolutely responsible, whether you're government or whoever, but everybody can do something because every little counts. Yeah. So thanks for raising that point. Katie, I'll ask you, just listen to all of this. Some terms have been mentioned, and there are some terms we hear about when we hear news about climate change. Sometimes you talk about adaptation, sometimes you talk about mitigation, sometimes I think Abimbola mentioned the UNFCCC. And at the moment, of course, we know there's a COP going on. We hear people talk about the COP, which happens usually around this time every year. So would you like to share with us some very basic explanations about what some of these common terms parents and our audience might hear about in the news and what it all means?
I'm very happy to do that. So looking at the difference between adaptation and mitigation first. So mitigation is anything that we can do to reduce those emissions of the gases that you've heard described earlier today. So Leeds as a council has, over the last 5 years, put an awful lot of work into that, into saying, how are we fueling our big buildings? How are we getting around the city? What kind of things are we doing that are detrimental in terms of putting more carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents into the atmosphere? And so we've done a lot of work around changing the way we heat things. So, for example, getting rid of gas boilers and burning fossil fuels, which you've heard earlier this evening, is causing huge damage, and replacing those systems with more sustainable methods. So, for example, we now use a lot of heat pumps or solar, where we were once burning fossil fuels, and hopefully all of that will bring down the emissions of our city. And the points Martin made are absolutely right. You know, we have to work on a big scale as a city with the things that we can control. And if we can work to bring them down, then that's something that's our responsibility to do. But whilst we're doing that, we also have to think about adaptation, because the climate is changing, and we can all see that. There is evidence all over the globe to tell us that the climate's changing. So adaptation is about the actions that we can take to reduce the impacts of climate change as those weather patterns change, or if we can't reduce them, to adapt to them. And as you've said earlier, that really depends on where you are on our planet in terms of those impacts. So one of the big things for us in Leeds is the impact of flooding. And so we've put an awful lot of resources and work into looking at where are the parts of the city that are more likely to flood than others, and what can we do in terms of structural built flood defences, but also natural flood defences. So, for example, building more trees and changing the shapes of our watercourses, and looking at what we can do to adapt. So we know that we've got an awful lot more to do as a city, but we are well aware that those two things, mitigation and adaptation, go hand in hand. Really, you can't change the climate changes that are already happening to us as a city, but you can try and have a big impact on not making things worse, and that's where the mitigation work comes in.
No, thank you very much for that, Katie. And I think just listening to you, one example I can draw from Bradford, for instance, is a clean air zone. So,
Mhm.
when government comes up with a policy of saying, well, this area, we're going to make it a clean air zone, is basically trying to bring together different elements. On the one hand, putting in a regulation, and then trying to use a financial incentive to make people do things that are good for the environment. In this case, using cars that do not cause more pollution in terms of the emissions from those cars. So, in a sense, what you then find is that there is a connection. So government might come up with a policy, they might not call it a climate policy, but if you think about it, you may find that they're trying to reduce the greenhouse gases so that we're not causing more problems. Because sometimes what happens is when there's an emission, it lasts what, 100 years? And then we get the effects. So in lots of the cases, what we're experiencing now was something that happened maybe centuries ago. And so we're just trying to be in a position where we're not doing worse for the environment for future generations. So it's not about us here and now. So even if we feel, well, it's not too hot, we can manage, we need to think about the fact that actually there is a generation and maybe generations coming who will be faced with something maybe worse and perhaps will struggle with it. So it's part of us saying, let's be a bit more responsible and not leave them a burden, and in so doing, let us reduce emissions. So that is the mitigation. And
And
then
and I understand it's already having an impact on health in Bradford, isn't it?
it is. Exactly, it is. It is. And it's very clear. And that's the other thing. So even the things we do now, we can even benefit already. So even just out of individual self-interest, it is quite useful for us to do things to protect the environment and to reduce emissions. And the other example I was thinking about is when people have to retrofit their homes. So if you live in a house, for instance, because of climate change, you may have to say, well, Katie mentioned flooding, so you may have to increase the height of, say, the sockets in the house, or you may have to build a house in a certain way that changes the position of certain things that will be prone to flooding if the house gets damaged by floods or something. So that's another thing that people sometimes do to adapt to climate change, depending on where they are. And of course, we've also had situations where communities have been asked to just leave because it's no longer sustainable for them to remain there because of rising sea levels. So we're already seeing examples of people being forced to adapt in one way or the other. So thanks a lot for raising those, Katie. Very helpful. I think we've covered some of the things. Oh yeah, there was a UNFCCC. So UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that is the main international law that regulates climate action, and it's formed the basis for states to come together and just agree on how they can work closely to ensure that they can reach this goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And sometimes you may hear people talk about the 1.5 degrees target. And I think that's a target that the world leaders have sort of agreed to guide them. So there's 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, but essentially let's reduce the emissions so that the temperature doesn't keep rising compared to, say, the 1990s, where industrialization wasn't as well, where our activities weren't as bad for the environment. And the other thing I'll mention is that when we talk about climate change, as we do currently, we're talking about climate change from the perspective of our actions as humans. So it's not about the climate changing on its own, because that also happens. But the point is the things we do as human beings is increasing the pace at which the changes are occurring. And that's why there's a problem. So thanks a lot for bringing up all those points. I think we can move to the next bit of the conversation. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A, and I see that there are some questions in there already, which we will come to as we go along. So to take us to the next bit, we'll now talk about what the impacts are. And the first question I would want us to think about is, we've talked about climate change. We understand what it means now. Hopefully, we know the difference between adaptation and mitigation and some of those key terms we hear. Within the context of young people, children, families, what are some of the ways in which climate change is affecting things? And I'll ask Abimbola, with your experience working with young people and women, if you could just tell us very briefly what the effects are that you can say you have noticed?
Okay, so the effects of climate change are enormous in the sense that they affect people differently based on their capacity to withstand this adverse impact, right? And some of the major ones that comes with rising sea level or extreme weather events, as the case may be, are of two different ways. So in my own country, in the context of the places where I've worked, one of the major impacts of climate change are environmental in nature, because where you have places or communities that have that has no existing waste management system or has no existing system that has to do with helping to curb various environmental issues that either come with companies who do manufacturing or household activities who conduct domestic activities. We have issues where children fall sick of having different kinds of diseases that come with either contaminated water or contaminated food. And one would wonder what's the linkage between these environmental change realities that has to do with food and water, and how does climate change impact it? So here is an example. Coastal communities, one of the communities or the places where my work is focused on are communities who are close to the coastline. And when there is issue concerning sea level rise, either by heavy rainfall or other environmental factors such as mining dredging the seabed, leaving certain level of void, there is this, it contributes to the rising sea level. And when we have rainfall, these water gets into their homes. And when they do, it touches their water sources, it touches their food, it touches every other factors outside, having them be vulnerable to destruction in terms of their homes, in terms of them having to migrate from one place to the other. And this particular issue, with no relevant or adequate or quick healthcare related services, these children are either down with cholera, that's like direct diseases, or they are either malnourished because there are no opportunities to get avenues to fend for themselves by their parents. That's 2. And 3, there is no adequate emergency response mechanisms that can help curb that impact from when there is a destruction or when there is heavy rainfall to how they will mitigate these issues. So for children and for parents, climate change affects them in 2 different ways. For parents, it's on another level because they lose their resources, the resources where they get employment from. For instance, let's take a farmer, for instance. Farmers have always known to have traditional approaches to farming, to harvesting, and to taking these products to markets, right? And when there is a change in the weather patterns, farmers do not have the coping mechanism to understand the dynamics, and that's where technology and other aspects comes in. So a farmer who has knowledge, traditional knowledge given down to him from one generation to the other, is experiencing these changes and cannot identify how to adapt to it, how to build relevant resilience, would lose his farming activities, because when he plants, if there's no adequate rainfall when rain is supposed to fall, and there's no adequate sunlight when there is supposed to be sunlight, then there is no food. And if we have extreme weather events where there is flash floods or flooding, it takes out the entire farming, his crops and everything, and the farmer is left with nothing. So at this level, this certain level of parents, in terms of those who provide us access to basic resources, those who form a part of our informal sectors, who are farmers, who are fishermen, they are lost for jobs. And these directly and indirectly affect their children, in the sense that they can't fend for them. They don't have food to put on the table. Then all that ripple effect that comes with introduction of new diseases based on waste mismanagement, coupled with flooding getting into the homes of people. Then a whole lot of these impacts are very messy, that it affects children at this point. So let's come to air. When it comes to air, we know that air pollution is one of the major environmental factors that is also triggered by changes in these events, right? And these changes in this event is these are the direct linkages from human activity down to the atmosphere, from the atmosphere down back to human impact, right? And children have to feel the brunt of new diseases, which we do not have the capacity to like understand, because climate change, with the weather changes, the introduction of new diseases that we do not know about, the introduction of new insects that we do not know about, and these impact the health, not just the healthcare services, but children as well. So these are some of the ways and the linkages to which climate change impact children and parents. For parents, it's more of the employment and access to their basic needs in terms of the dignity of rights, having shelter, having food, having employment. And for children, it comes with health-related challenges because they're too fragile to withstand these impacts that the environmental change reality triggered by either global warming and the changes in the climate system is causing on healthcare services.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's really critical, the issues you've mentioned. You've talked about the loss of infrastructure. You've talked about the loss of livelihood. You've also talked about the health challenges, which, to be fair, could also affect both old and young, children, elderly people, young persons. So there are very many angles to this. And I think it just reminds us of how critical it is that we address climate change, because otherwise there are impacts. And even beyond the physical impacts, the destruction to infrastructure, there's also the mental side of it, because there's a lot of anxiety around the changes. Like it or not, if you don't know the direction of change, chances are that it will cause stress. And then if it's happening in a way that people aren't used to, and maybe it's very intense, like when we have extreme weather events, then it becomes even more stressful and could lead to anxiety and all sorts of mental health challenges as well. So these are very dire consequences. Of course, I should also mention that sometimes the impacts may not seem bad, especially in the short term. So there are times when not to be flippant, but say, oh, it's not as cold as it used to be, and then people are happy about it. But I think we have to remember that that has consequences for other things as well. So it may not be as cold as it used to be, but think about maybe the penguins or the polar bears or other life forms that actually require that cold weather. If they don't have it anymore, then what happens to them? So we need to be thinking beyond ourselves when we consider the consequences and impacts of climate change, and remember that we're all in this together. So the world is all connected. So it's not about our convenience in our spaces, but it's about the big picture and how something happening in this part of the world may be affecting other parts of the world in ways that we don't even know. So thanks for raising that. Katie, let me ask you, based on your experience as a town councillor, what would you say are some of the ways in which climate change has implications for local communities?
Thank you. So the implications for communities are hugely varied, and it depends very much on where the community is. So, for example, the speed of change might be different in terms of the changes that are coming to communities. Different effects, we've already mentioned some of the effects of climate change might be changes in temperature, might be severe weather effects, might be flooding. And some communities are much more vulnerable than others in terms of their ability to withstand those changes, as you've already heard this evening. So, and also the pace of change. You know, some communities are experiencing dramatic change right now, and other communities aren't. And so that's another variable, really, in terms of what's happening. My own community here in East Leeds, the changes are so often seen very far away in terms of where the big effects of climate change are, and the effects, I think, are yet to be felt significantly in this part of Leeds. But I think it's really important not to just focus on the negative aspects that are coming to communities, because one thing that I've seen really make a difference is in the response in communities to things that we need to do. So, for example, here in East Leeds, in the last 3 years that we've been part of a climate project, we now have a community allotment, we have a community orchard, we have an active travel hub, and we have people walking and cycling who have not been doing so in the past. We brought the community together in a lot of ways, and it has a positive effect. You've already said about the climate anxiety and how sometimes it can be a real worry, particularly for young people. And I think it's important for them to see that as communities, we're coming together and we're saying, what can we do? How can we address the two issues of adaptation and of mitigation at a very, very local level, and make changes that are really going to impact on people's lives. And I don't think we can underestimate the power of that, really. I think communities feel more empowered when they're acting and when they're working together and they're making a difference and making change.
No, thank you very much for that, Katie. And I think I would say we've got similar experiences as well in Shipley. So, for instance, we've had a lot of community groups taking action, direct action that you can see in relation to the environment. So things like the allotments, even the active travel hub as well. And interestingly, the active travel hub, for instance, it may have started out as doing something for the environment, but you see, it's also helping people's well-being. Because in organizing community walks, people just coming together, people are building new networks, friendships, getting to know other parts of the town. So in a sense, it almost feels like doing something for climate also has the potential to translate into good in other areas as well, whether it's health or whether it's just putting something back to improve the well-being around the community. So there's every reason to do something for the environment and for climate, not just for the sake of the environment, but also for the sake of our shared well-being and cohesion as well.
Absolutely. So, and we've seen it address issues of loneliness and people are finding a reason to get out. We've got a community composter, and we've linked it with a local cafe. So if you bring your caddy to the composter, you get a token for a free drink. And so we have people sitting in the cafe talking about their composting over a cup of coffee and meeting people that they wouldn't have met before. And the same activities are happening in our allotment and our forest garden, that it's bringing people together. And as you say, that's a great thing for people's well-being.
No, thanks for that, Katie. I think we've got a comment asking, where is this happening? So the experiences that Katie's sharing are happening in Leeds, and the experiences that I'm sharing are happening in Shipley, Bradford as well. Thank you. And I see a comment there saying children having strange rashes on their skins as the temperature is too hot for them. Yes, indeed. So there will be all of these reactions to the changes in the environment or in the climate, more like. And what we would say to that is thanks for mentioning that, but always for us to seek advice as well from the medical professionals, because I think it's a learning process for everybody. So if there's something new that parents are experiencing with children, then it's also a good idea to sort of let the health professionals know, let the GPs know, even if it's not something they've seen before, but at least they would now know that this is happening and they can curate that and advise on how best to manage the process. So thanks for mentioning that. I think the next question I have, just around the same issues, Martin, I'm just wondering, based on the work you do in Climate Action Leeds, do you have any suggestions in terms of support that's available to families or parents in and around Leeds?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I know that on the first bullet point there, why should parents care about climate change? I think the vast majority of parents will and do care about climate change in some way. Obviously every parent cares about the future for their children. So I think that whether it was like the really serious and direct examples that Abimbola was talking about there, or whether it's to do with, as Katie mentioned earlier on, flooding in Leeds, for example, and the sort of damage that can cause to people's homes, they're both practical examples, but parents may also just have a general kind of fear when they see some of the newspaper coverage and headlines about climate change, about what that world is going to be like for their children in future. I think in terms of trying to find resources and support around that, I think there's kind of different ways to go about it. I think that there are quite a lot of quite useful books now available, just from looking in local libraries, written for children of different ages, where topics that are to do with the climate and climate change and the environment are presented in a way that is kind of appropriate for children. Obviously, we know different kids, even at different ages, can have very different levels of understanding and kind of thoughtfulness. Parents are always going to be the best people to judge what type of book or TV program or whatever it might be is appropriate for their child at that stage. But I think that because this is a topic that has been covered a lot more generally in the media in the past, maybe 10, 15 years in particular, then I think there is increasingly versions of that for children that are not about patronizing them or minimizing the issue, but again, striking a balance when this is something that is a big topic that they have had very little involvement in contributing to in a negative way so far. So I think that's one way. I think that, as you both touched on, yourself and Katie, the potential for groups that are connected to mitigating or adapting against climate change in some way, whether that's an active travel hub or a composting or a community allotment or any number of different things. Being involved in those things is probably useful in and of itself, because you'll probably meet other families that care about these same issues as well. So getting that sense of not feeling alone if you are worried about climate change for your children, or it's something that you want to feel like you're taking action on for them, then going along to something like that, even the fact that people have come here to this event tonight online, hopefully that is in some way reassuring and kind of motivating, because there's a chance to connect with other parents and other, for your children even, to connect with other young people that do care about this and are obviously, saying the composting thing, working to have a positive impact. And I suppose as parents, we can also try, I think sometimes with big topics, it can feel for parents as well, not just children, very overwhelming. It can feel a bit like, what can I do about this? When it's to do with airline companies or oil companies or whatever. I think sometimes if we feel like within our own lives, and it's exactly as you said earlier, Paddy, not everybody can do the same thing, but almost everybody can do something, even if it feels quite small. Doing that consistently can still feel like a really powerful thing to show your own children that, whether that is walking to school with them if you can, or, ensuring that they're able to ride a bike if they've got one, or, when you're cooking, making sure that you don't throw any food away, so there's no food wastage. So anything like that, I think that if that's part of the children's daily kind of everyday experience, then as a parent, you can decide how much you want to link that to wider climate change, depending on how old they are and how interested they are. But at least then you are helping them build those habits and kind of positive habits, just as part of their daily life anyway, without them feeling like that they have the responsibility for kind of fixing climate change, which obviously is not going to be fair or accurate for a kind of a 9-year-old who's just come home from school. But yeah, I do think that maybe thinking about those things that we can do in our own lives can actually be beneficial for how parents are feeling, and also for children as well, I would hope. There's examples, as you mentioned, there's examples of that kind of thing, what communities have done on the Climate Action Leeds website, and I can always post a link into the chat later, just in case anybody would like to have a look to see what some of the communities have done. Because, as we've said before, it's not like everybody in every community will be able to do the same thing, but there might be parts of that are of interest to people.
No, thank you very much for sharing those tips, because I think you've highlighted some of the things parents can do to even support their children with the anxiety around climate change. And like you say, it's like any big discussion we need to have as parents with young people and children. not to downplay the issue, because even if you downplay it at home, they'll go out and they'll hear something different. And it's sometimes even worse, because then they're in an environment where it's not controlled, and then the information is being presented maybe in not the best manner. But as parents and at home, within the confines of the home, you've got the power and the space, the resources to provide the information, first of all, that is correct, and provide it in a way that is suited to your child's or young person's learning needs and capacity to take in that information. So that's really key. The other thing is, and I think you mentioned this, Martin, there's some examples. I know I found a book recently where it was, I think they had 12 case studies or so of young people who had been taking action around climate and environment in their different countries. And I thought that was very powerful, because what it then does is, it's not an adult saying do this or do that, but it's you just saying this is what people have done, and it's very often relatable, because these are really young people who are either in high school or primary school, but are just doing things that are within their own environment. And it's also inspiring in a way. So what I would suggest is for parents to also think about books and resources. Martin has mentioned some, and I think on the various websites which we have sort of curated on the parents resource page, there are examples of communities, but also children, young people who are doing things around climate and environment, because we also don't want to put children and young people under pressure. So we're not saying go home and tell them you have to do this. No, but we're just saying just show them examples, and who knows what will speak to them, and just let them go with the flow and see what they come out with, or come up with. But more importantly, those individual habits are also really important. So if you're able to explain to young people why it's important not to waste food, not only because of the economic reasons in terms of you just wasting money, but also because if the food goes to waste and it goes to the landfill, then that also contributes to climate change because of the greenhouse gases, emissions, and things like that. And of course, it's polluting the environment, it's polluting land and water, those kinds of things. So these are all practical reasons why they should not waste food. But in a sense, it's also something that contributes to climate and environment. So it's all linked together. And sometimes it makes a world of difference if you tell young people why not to do something. So it's not about saying, don't do this, walk to school, don't use this, or don't leave the lights on, but it's about explaining to them why you're saying don't do this or do the other. And I think that's where it's easier for them to walk the road with you and then take on those good habits as well. So thanks for sharing those examples. And I think it leads us nicely to the next bit, which is around any examples we have of innovations and actions by young people. But I'll expand this: actions by young people or communities that really speak to doing something about climate change. And the reason I'm expanding this is that I've seen a question in the Q&A which sort of highlights this thing about what are we doing anyway to address climate change. So if any of the panelists could share with us examples of young people or communities, and Martin, thanks for the link which you've shared, taking action to address climate change and improve well-being and sustainability. That would be really helpful. Who would like to go first on that one? Examples of people doing things for climate change.
Okay, I think I could go first. So there are various examples of young people championing positive impact to help their community, to help the global community or whatever communities that they represent. And while some of them are large actions, others are just simple everyday actions that are making meaningful change. And I'd like to highlight the smaller actions that are making meaningful change so that it relates to our guests, so that they can also take these key takeouts to also adapt in their everyday lives, which I'm sure some of them have, and some of them are only looking for a way to learn more to be able to adapt these changes. So I'll highlight 2 ways which young people have been able to devise positive impacts to help shape climate innovation. So I know of a young person in Africa, I think Rwanda, who is currently using education to help, which I consider as innovation in the sense that he uses local languages and also local materials to help influence his community at the local level. And why do I see that as innovation? When people talk about innovation, they just think you have to develop a product that is highly technologically advanced. But innovation can just be using everyday simple daily activities to help influence change. And he's been able to mobilize about 5,000 of his communities, and they've been introduced to regenerative agricultural processes because they are highly big on agriculture. And through this climate change knowledge, he's been able to move his community to do things about planting trees, doing farming activities so that it can help mitigate, flooding when there is heavy flood. Because they had three major problems. One, farmers are always very impacted by, like I mentioned before, climate change. And two, they always have issues concerning debt because their crops are being swept off. They don't have means of employment. And so they've been able to incorporate different regenerative agricultural purposes by using trees to help, help to solidify their farming activities, which is one. And also others could be doing other domestic activities in your own lives, which could be helping to reduce the way you emit carbon, understanding how footprints are to help take stock of your own personal carbon footprint, and also help educate other people on how to reduce the carbon footprint. It could be jumping the bus, it could be using the bicycle, depending on whatever economy that you're in. And for us in Africa, some of the African countries that we do not have this culture of using bicycles on our road because we do not have such roads. There are other things that one could do, and there are various ways you can develop this innovation. It could be in the area of agriculture, it could be in the area of energy, it could be in the area of advocacy and ensuring that your community is being included in policy formulation processes. For me, as a young person, I saw a gap, and the gap was young people feel climate change subject doesn't concern them, whereas it does. Others do not understand how it affects them, and so they cannot actively participate. And the other sector knows how it affects them, but they feel it's not a subject they can concern themselves with, and they were willing to learn. And so I decided to, okay, why not conduct a training program where I teach them all the areas of climate change, from gender to equality to technology to policy. And it worked out fine. And I would say that as a young person in Africa, I've been able to train 800 people across the 6 continents and giving them opportunity to intern with organizations leading in climate tech and other aspects in terms of energy, which would help build their mindsets to be able to influence their community positively. And if we look around us, we'll see other young people doing a lot of work in terms of activism, ensuring that the government is listening to the concerns of the people. These are various kinds of innovation, because once we say innovation, we think it's supposed to be a product we're supposed to be developing. And innovation can just be as little as incorporating your community and ensuring that they understand where the pain points are, and also they can develop ways to help themselves adapt while mitigating to the impact of climate change.
Thank you so much for that, Abimbola. And I should say thank you for the good work that you do. In fact, for the great, excellent work that you do. Well done. Any other examples of innovations? Katie, Martin?
Well, before I share, I would also like to say what amazing work that you've been doing, and it is hugely impressive. So a huge congratulations from me as well. I just wanted to highlight some of the work that young people in Leeds are doing. So we have a youth council in Leeds, and they were tasked with choosing some wishes for the city. And one of the wishes was that everybody takes more action against climate change, which as a councillor was brilliant to see, because it's coming from the young people, and it's good that's the kind of thing that they would like to see us doing as a council, and it's really important that they're there pushing us to do that. But we've got some brilliant groups in schools and youth groups that are being led just by the same kind of level of inspiring young people who just want to make change. Our children's mayor, we have a children's mayor in Leeds who is elected every year by the school children of Leeds. They vote, and then one young person has the job for a year. And last year's Children's Mayor had a manifesto that was based on climate change, and that was great to see. A very, very inspiring young man. But then you also mentioned that the everyday actions that are happening, and all the things that we've talked about really good community climate action and how good it is for well-being and connections, as well as climate change, is exactly true for young people. So I've visited lots of schools where young people have set up gardening projects, and they're growing their own food, and they're linking that to climate change, and they're looking at ways of getting to school that are more sustainable, and really emphasizing the way that they're eating food and they're growing food and they're moving around the city, and seeing that their actions can make a difference. And a lot of them are small things, but they're really important for them. And you see a group of young children who are digging and growing their own food and are able to explain why that's better for the planet that they do that, and why we shouldn't be putting food on planes and flying it from one place to another. And it's education, but it's also really positive for their own well-being, because it's a communal activity and it's learning together. So you could pop into any school in Leeds over the week, and you would see climate groups and eco councils and things that are doing really, really positive work. There's a great network of amazing young people in Leeds.
Thank you so much for that, Katie. Martin, would you want to weigh in at all?
I'd echo again the applause for Abby Bowler's work, 100%. And also, from what Katie said, I went to a talk involving the former Children's Mayor, and he was extremely impressive. I thought he was a great example, Mohammed, of the level of engagement that people, even at a young age in Leeds, I think he was 10 at the time, or possibly 11, were both have for climate change, and the eloquence with which they can speak about it. Just to give a couple of examples from some of the projects that have been delivered as part of Climate Action Leeds. In one of our hub areas where we have different communities around the city, we had I linked it in the chat there, but a good blog account from one of the young people who's involved in that community area. And one of the things that she had done was organise a group of volunteers to go along after a local music festival, because there was traditionally quite a lot of material, both sort of food, drinks, camping equipment, tents, that sort of thing, just abandoned by people after the festival. And her and some other young people went along with some vans and collected, I think from the article, it's almost 150 kilograms of food and hygiene products and things that could be reused safely and hygienically. So obviously stuff that was unopened. And we're able to distribute that to food banks and kind of charities in the local area. So that was a way that for them, they had that sense of feeling empowered, because they were visually cleaning up an area that was going to be very littered and kind of polluted effectively, but also avoiding all of those items which were perfectly good to use and could benefit people, avoiding all of those items just being wasted. So I suppose when we talk about the carbon impact of different industries and different sectors, all of those things would have taken resources and effort to produce, and they would have all just been binned, basically, which would have been a big waste of materials. Thanks to the efforts of those young people, they were distributed locally, also to people in communities that will actually really benefit from those things. That's obviously saving them money. People might have been living in some really challenging circumstances. So I thought that was a nice example of something that they just got together, went out and had a really positive impact through doing something very practical. And then as another, I suppose, example, this was a project done with and kind of for young people in an area of North Leeds called Alwoodley. All the 7 primary schools there got together, and they picked a time in England when the weather tends to be slightly better, hopefully, and decided to have a big push across all those schools on active transport. So essentially helping families get their children to school without having to use a car, if that's what they normally did. But I thought it was really impressive because as part of that, they did a lot of listening before the week itself to try and understand, was there barriers to the families doing that, which would normally mean even if they wanted to walk or cycle or use a scooter, they were driving anyway. And in response to that, before this week, I think they fixed about 400 bicycles that people had across their families, but were in, they were old or they were broken. So they did that for free. And they also had an offer where people who were very confident cyclists and were kind of, safely part of this project would go out to people if they wanted to and show them a safe route to cycle to school and cycle that with them to build up their confidence. So that was something that they would feel more confident to do in the future as well, not just in this 1 week. So I thought that was a really good example because I can't remember, it might have been yourself, Paddy, who mentioned Tester Power earlier on, but getting the children excited about that kind of put, in a good way, some pressure on their parents because it was an activity the family could do together, but also the people involved in that week really tried to do everything they could to make it as easy as possible for those families and young kids, in this case, their primary school children, to be involved. And hopefully the positive experience of having done that will mean that for at least some of those families, walking or cycling or scooting to school will be something they do more regularly in the future. And obviously that removes whatever carbon emissions that they might have created by driving their children to school, 5 days a week. So even if it's 1 day a week, then that still makes a difference.
Thank you so much for raising those examples or for sharing those examples, Martin. And I mean, it's very important to see that young people are already doing things, and we've got very similar in Bradford as well, Shipley, because we also have eco councils in primary schools, and we had an eco fair on the 19th of October, and as part of the eco fair we had a poetry, so it was a poem tree, and children from schools around were able to send in entries. And it was really, really inspiring to see the messaging that was coming through in the poems that they wrote about the environment. So I guess that's something we could also encourage children to do at home, to just express themselves through poetry. For some people, it was pictures. For some people, it was stories. Just allow them express themselves. And this example of children walking to school as well, actively, because it's good for their health, but it's also good for the environment. And it's good for the parents as well, who do it alongside the children if they are able to. So that's also a good example. And then I was thinking about when we had the eco fair, we actually had young people who delivered workshops on different environmental issues, which again, I think is a very good example of taking action from the angle of young people. So they delivered the workshops, were able to raise awareness about the themes they were interested in, but also to show that they were able to contribute to the conversation. So it wasn't a case of it's an eco fair, they just come watch and leave, but they were actively involved in the process as well. And when we had our citizens jury on climate, between 2022 and 2023, we had young people who were part of that process as well, which is really good because it was intergenerational. So we had young people, we had people from various sectors, different ages, and that really helped a lot because it then meant that the outcome was really inclusive and reflective of the priorities of the community at large, as against one demographic or the other. So indeed, they're very good examples of young people doing things around climate, and it could be anything at all, depending on what their interests are, their capacity, and the ways in which they want to get involved. So those are really good examples, and I think it's already happening. So as parents, as guardians, let us encourage the young people around us to do the things that they are interested in and to just support them through that. I know that Abimbola needs to leave because something's just come up for her. And so I'll ask her this last question, if that's okay, and then we can come back to Martin and Katie. So Abimbola, if you could just share with us some, as closing, since you've got to leave, what are some of the action points you could suggest for families or parents at home to take on in terms of advancing climate action?
Okay, thank you. But before then, I apologize that I have an emergency and I have to drop off. My apologies for that. So for parents, I'll just come from three perspectives. And the first perspective is education, because without education, you cannot give what you do not have. So parents need to understand the concepts, what's going on in the global arena in terms of climate change, environmental change realities, even if it is not affecting everyone now, at some point it will if we do not take the actions that we should. So parents need to learn about these concepts, know about the various impacts of these concepts, and also help educate their children, because the first teacher that children have is their parents. And they also live by example. Whatever they see their parents do, that's what they take on. And the teacher is the second. So the house or the home is the first point of contact in terms of education, learning, and values for children. So parents need to make extra effort, and there are various resources. One resource that I would love to share is the Earth Operators Manual. So the Earth Operators Manual is, you can find it on YouTube. It's 1 and 2. That was the first resource I used to learn the concept about climate change and how the entire ecosystem works hand in hand, right? So parents can watch that. You could share with your kids. It's very relatable. That's what I used to start. And also, I could share my book with you because it gives you an everyday aspect on how parent can work, and also it makes it relatable, giving examples as well. I'll share the link with Dr. Petty. You can download it. It's free. So, and I love your feedback on that. So education is really key. And so this education can now translate into action. How do I use my everyday life and make it more sustainable for the planet? When you have food waste, you can convert them into compost. You can use them in your gardens. And there are various resources on YouTube on how to do DIY compost using waste, food waste, right? So in as much as I don't advocate for food waste, buy what you can eat at that time. We cannot curb waste, right? Because we have people, like, it's uncontrollable, right? It's not something some of us, budget for. But if by chance you have food waste, there are ways you can convert them, use them as compost, manure, and the likes. So that's another one. Try to reduce your wastewater processes and make it more timely, make it more conscious, change, how you consume power generally, right? Which could be, these are some of it, and also participating in local action in terms of volunteering at a local organization, taking your kids along, making them do fun DIY environmental sustainability actions, like how to recycle plastics, how to make them, get new homes for nurseries using plastics. Children are very creative, and this is some of the ways you can build their creativity using sustainable materials. So these and many more that the other guests will share are many ways parents can take action, right? Not everybody can be an activist, right? But people can make a change. Joining conversations in terms of policy making, because you might be interested, or you might find something on the policy document of your country or your state that you're not okay with. It's your time to voice out. And there are ways which you can do that. Every country has their system. You follow the procedures of your system to speak out about it. And the last thing is, I know most times we clamor for change and people tend to want to push the blame on the government. While we know that the government has its own setbacks, pros and cons, we should go beyond blaming the system. Now, everybody must work hand in hand to ensure that we build a collective, sustainable society for children, for ourselves as well. Yeah. Right. So I guess that's my feedback, and I'm sorry I have to go now. It was nice meeting everyone.
Thank you so much. And thanks for offering to share the book as well. We'll put that on.
Yes, I will share that. Bye-bye.
Excellent.
Thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Yes.
Thanks everyone. So I think we can now just sort of wrap up with the resources, and Abimbola has kindly already shared with us some resources. We've put up some of them which we've received from Katie. Martin, thanks for kindly sharing on the parents resource page as well. What are the resources available from local councils to support families with climate change adaptation and mitigation? Katie, would you like to take that one?
So one of the problems with local councils developing resources is, I don't know what the councils are like for other people on the call, but certainly here in the UK, our councils face an awful lot of challenges on our budgets. And the fact that we can post an awful lot of information on the internet is a real plus for us, because it's a low cost way of getting information out. So I think I've shared some resources that the council has. We have a website called Leeds by Example, and the idea is that it's a place that we can put lots and lots of things that people are doing, and ways that people, all the things that you've just heard about, that people can do in their own lives. So we're very keen to promote that as a resource. And we also, as a council, produce a monthly e-newsletter which people can sign up to, and that brings together things that the council's been doing, but also things that the residents can take advantage of. So we've just had a round of grants available for people to do retrofit work in their homes, and that'll go onto the newsletter so that people can access it. But we do find that it is a real problem for us as a council trying to get our information out. It would be great if we could speak directly to everybody who lives in Leeds and say, these are the things that your council is doing, and these are the things that you can do. Here are some great examples of climate action across the city. But the truth is, it's actually quite difficult because our resources are limited. Yeah. And we're not able to speak directly to everybody. But I think one of the themes that really has been quite prevalent this evening has been how important working communities is. And that's somewhere that we can have a voice as a council, because each area in Leeds has its own councillors who can be active and be part of the things that the community is doing.
No, thank you very much for that, Katie. And I think I share with you in saying the councils have very limited resources. But then on the other hand, what I would then say is to encourage everyone so that if the council puts out any resource at all, then take advantage of it.
Yes,
you know, because it's gone through a lot to put that out. And very often you find that there are things that are very relatable, because of course the council is operating at a community level. So within Shipley Town Council, for instance, we've got the Eco Fair, which happens once a year. And at the last Eco Fair we even had things like clothes swaps. You know, people could just come in and get things. There was a lot of examples of people reusing items. There were practical classes being held. There were the workshops and all that. So just look out for information about these kinds of activities around you. And then we also have a grant scheme. So we've got the Shipley Green Grant Scheme, which is open to anyone who's doing any work on climate action within Shipley.
I think as well, Katie, as you mentioned earlier on, there was the Green Libraries Week held by Leeds Council quite recently. I know I've spoken to a few of the librarians there and hoping to get in to some libraries off the back of that. So that's another way in that council, obviously, like you said, are engaging with communities. I think just because this might link to the questions that have already been asked, two thoughts I'd have on what we can all do. One thing I would say is, because I'm conscious of people, you know, from the chat with a lot of expertise and experience in this area on the call, is when we are already involved in some way in the kind of climate action movement, or that's a part of your professional or personal routine or area of work. I think one thing that we are really trying to do is to ensure that, kind of like what Katie was saying there, when we are messaging, we're trying to understand better how to put that message across in a way that's going to reach as many different people as possible. So for us recently, that's been a case of going to speak to some university students and understand when they're consuming content online, so usually via TikTok or Instagram, what does that need to look like for them to feel that it's relevant and that they're going to stay and watch the whole of that video if it's 60 seconds or whatever. That's not something that I know. You know, I wouldn't even know how to work TikTok or necessarily know what's going to resonate with a kind of an average 18-year-old in Leeds. But those students do know, and it's the kind of thing about we need to continue to get out to them, listen to them, and try as much as we can to work with them. Because even if I listen really carefully to them and feel like I've understood it as well as I can, they will be able to talk to their own demographic of people much better than I can. And that can be to do with age, it can be to do with cultural background. But I think when we've got some knowledge already, realizing that we might need to change our messaging or just collaborate with other people who will be able to deliver those messages better than we ever could is a big part of it.
Other thing I want to mention from the council side is that, and I'm sure this is true for Leeds as well, otherwise please correct me, Katie, the committee meetings are open to the public. So there will be a part of the meeting that is confidential, but otherwise most of it is open to the public, which means that we can get involved, attend the meetings, and directly contribute to the conversations around climate change within our local community. So I would encourage all of us to look at the local council website and see what activities are already ongoing. And if there's a committee on climate and environment, then just attend those meetings and at least be aware of what the council is doing, and be sure that it's representative of your priorities as well. And if not, then of course, like Katie mentioned, reach out to your town councillor or whichever councillor or MPs representing you so that they can be the voice for you in those arenas where they sit. Yeah. Thank you. So I think let's have a quick look at the questions we have in the Q&A, and I'll read through them and see if there are some of them that we can cover. So the first one, and thanks to all our attendees, participants who have sent in questions, who have been commenting in the chat area. You've been a fantastic audience, so thank you. There's a question here. How is climate change affecting Pakistan's ecosystems and agriculture, particularly in arid regions like Balochistan? And what sustainable strategies can help communities adapt to these challenges? So I think, well, on behalf of the panel, we haven't specifically looked at Pakistan or any other countries outside of the UK. But what I would say is, if you look at the resources available, which we've just shared now and which we will share subsequently via email as well, there will be some general examples of things that communities can do. So we might not be able to speak to the Pakistan example directly, but depending on what the issues are, it could be about changing agricultural practices, it could be about retrofitting, which we've mentioned here today, it could be about just adaptation, various forms of adaptation, depending on what the experiences are. But if there's anything more specific you want us to address, then maybe just write to us or send us the information and we'll try to address that. How can we effectively address climate change when our country or relevant departments lack seriousness about forest conservation and other environmental issues? And from the meaning of mitigation, the actions or things we do to reduce the impacts, also it was mentioned that adaptation is the things we do. Oh, yes. Okay. I'll clarify that one. And then I'll leave the difficult question about how to engage departments that are unserious to Katie. So the mitigation is about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So that's mitigation. And adaptation is about trying to adjust the way we live or the way we engage with different things in the environment because climate change is happening. So how do we reduce the impact on us? So maybe that was a mix up. So the reducing the impact is the adaptation side of it, and mitigation is reducing the emissions or cutting down on emissions and reducing the greenhouse gases. I hope that answers the question. So Katie, do you have any suggestions on how to engage? My understanding is government or politicians, especially if they aren't receptive. We know you're receptive, Katie, but to those who may not be as receptive, how do we engage them?
So I think the more people put pressure on governments that aren't acting, the better. And we have seen in recent years some excellent examples, particularly from young people with the youth climate strikes. Which I really believe had an impact on governments of actually getting loud, getting noisy and making them listen. But that's a very difficult thing to do. And as was said previously, not everybody can be an activist. And I think that there are ways to lobby. You know, we can write, we can email, we can, as you've said, Paddy, we can attend meetings and make our voices heard at meetings. So there are ways that we can make our politicians know that we really care about this issue. But the other thing I would like to say is that however bad they might be, it doesn't stop the actions that we can take as individuals and as communities. And I take great enthusiasm from that, really, you know, particularly when I look at the work that's happening in Leeds on a very, very local level, because that's having an impact too. You know, you look at the work that's happening in all our communities where people are reducing their emissions, where people are looking and talking and coming together. That's going to make a difference if it's happening at scale, if lots of communities are doing it. So I would say try not to be disheartened because the change isn't there at the level it's required. And it's shocking to watch COP after COP come and go with promises that are not fulfilled. But as individuals, we can make a difference at a local level.
Thank you very much for that, Katie. You see, I knew you would know the answer.
I just
you.
answer that, Eddie, really quickly, just on that. It's not in terms of getting the politicians to act, but just in terms of everyone's capacity to affect people in their organisations or the groups they're in. That could be, you know, if you're going on to somewhere with friends, you could share a car rather than driving separately. If you're involved in coaching a sports team that your son or daughter is involved in, you could try and get them to use reusable drink bottles rather than getting them to, you know, throw away plastic bottles every time they have a training session. It could be volunteering to be a climate or green rep at your place of work to see if you know, you could change something about how much resources are getting used when they don't necessarily need to be. So as well as, you know, voting, and I think the points you made are really important about people feeling that they've got a right to go along to those public events and that they've got value to add and knowledge to share at those, but also that all of us will be involved in kind of different networks. And even if it means we can't call the Prime Minister up directly, you can have an impact just through the connections you already have. And you never, you know, your influence on your co-worker or your, you know, brother-in-law or whoever it is, they might then have a conversation with somebody else. So I think feeling like you said earlier on, everyone's kind of connected in that way. That hopefully is encouraging as well in the way that Katie talked about the community level action being encouraging.
No, thanks a lot for that, Martin. And there's a question here, how do the actions and policies of developed countries contribute to climate change? And how does this impact developing countries like Pakistan, particularly in terms of increased flooding, natural disasters, and other environmental challenges? Well, I think it's maybe slightly outside the scope of this conversation, but if the panelists want to speak to this, that's fine. But what I would say is there's a lot of information on the government website as well. So for instance, the UK government has got its Climate Change Act, and the Climate Change Act provides the legal framing around climate action by the UK. And what you'll find is that in various countries like Pakistan and other countries across the world, they would have laws that also deal with climate change, environment, and things like that. There's also a lot of at the global level, for instance, with the COP, you have a lot of opportunities for countries to come together and think about how to support each other, especially countries that are so-called developed or industrialized, supporting countries that are developing or poorer or in less or more vulnerable to climate change, even though they have contributed less in terms of historic emissions. So there are all sorts of conversations going on, but it's slightly outside the scope of this conversation here today. But if you have any specifics around families or parents, then please feel free to highlight those and we'll try to answer them. Yeah. And then the final one is populations of low and middle income countries have a much lower per capita, much lower impact on the global environment. Per capita emissions of greenhouse gases in the USA, for example, are over 7 times higher than in China and 19 times higher than in Africa. But developing countries are bearing the bigger burden of climate change. My question is, what actions are developed countries taking to mitigate the effects? Thank you for that question. And I'm hoping that in the conversations we've had with Katie sharing what's happening in Leeds, with me sharing what's happening in Shipley, with Martin sharing what Climate Action Leeds is doing as well, and then with Abimbola sharing those examples which she provided, which interestingly show that there's action going on not just in the Global South, but no, not just in the global north, but also in the global south as well. So she gave examples of, I think, Rwanda. So what you find is that even those countries that we see as being highly vulnerable and less responsible are already taking action. So everyone is doing something, everyone's doing their bit. And I think that's what we want to encourage as much as possible, so that we all feel empowered to do something, whatever it is, no matter how little, but we're all doing something to address the climate crisis and to contribute to positive climate action as well. So I would say thank you so much to everyone who sent in comments, who sent in suggestions, questions. Martin, was that you? I'm just looking at the chats.
Yes, that one. I didn't want to cut you while you were
Yes,
talking.
maybe if you want to say that, yeah, that's fine. If you want to highlight that bit, but I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yes, it was just to say those two questions. I think, yeah, like as Paddy said, massive topic that we probably can't cover in a webinar like this. But I think those two questions, yeah, touch on that the idea or the phrase of the just transition, which I'm sure lots of people are already familiar with. But you might wish to read more about that as well. There's been some interesting politicians from other countries outside of what would traditionally be called the developed countries, like Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, who's been speaking at multiple COPs now and really pushing that agenda for the countries which are being massively affected but have not historically made those big had that big climate impact in the same way.
Thank you so much for that. And I would say thank you to each and every one of us for staying until now, but also for your interest, your engagement. It's been really, I've enjoyed the conversation, and I'm hoping that it's been the same for all of you. We have resources already. We've received resources from Katie, from Martin, from Abimbola, which will be circulated to everyone via email. We have a dedicated parents resource page where we put in resources from our panelists across the years. As we go on with the various webinars, we just set up a page that's specifically focused on a topic for each webinar, and then we put in all the resources we have there. So we'll share that with you via email after now. We also like to conduct a survey at the end of each webinar, and please, if everyone could please leave their comments. It's really important to us, because first of all, it allows us to understand how today's webinar has been for you, what your experiences have been, what areas we could improve on, what areas we can reinforce. And also, if there's a topic you want us to cover in our next webinar, this is an opportunity for you to let us know so that we can deliver programming that is suited to your priorities and needs as well. So please do take our survey, and we look forward to hearing back from you. We also have the parent resource page, which I've already mentioned. So if you scan this, it'll take you straight to that page, and you'll see the resources from previous webinars as well. So we've had webinars on GCSE A levels. We've had webinars on safeguarding. We've had webinars on mental health and neurodiversity, a wide range of topics, all tailored to supporting parents to realize what I call their superpowers of being parents who are there for their children, but also are well in themselves. Because my background's in law, and in law we say you can't give what you don't have. So parents have to be well in themselves to be able to support the young people and children in their care. This is also a link to an ongoing research which we are conducting. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we're the parent team, but there's also the research team, which conducts research on various topics around children, young people from Black minority ethnic backgrounds as well. And we would like to hear your voices through this research as well. Now, the focus of this research is really to understand how African children, especially Black African children, are supported with their racial identities at home and within their communities as well. And this is something that we're all involved in. So whether or not you have a Black African child living with you or in your care, you're part of the ecosystem, you're part of the society which these children live in. So it'll be very important for us to hear your opinions as well and understand your perspectives on the issue. It's a very short survey. It won't take you more than 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes tops. So please do take the survey. You can just scan, and this would lead you to the questions, and it's easy to complete as well. So we look forward to hearing back from you on all of these. And I think this brings us nicely to talking about our next program for November. Again, the team has put together a program which we've called Africaneness Neurodiversity Community Program. And that program is really focused on neurodiversity, and it's been running for the past few months. And the next series, which is series 5, so it started about 4 months ago, and we've got one for every month. So the next comes up on the 29th of November, and we'll be looking at how to navigate the challenges of parenting a neurodivergent child in the UK. So this is something that, again, I would say it's not only for parents who have children that are neurodivergent, but it's for all of us. Because sometimes you're in a public place and you see a parent struggling with a child. If you don't understand why, then you may not be able to be empathetic and provide the best support that you can possibly provide. So sometimes I say all of this information is really important, because you never know when someone around you may need it. You never know when you may become that support system for them because you have the knowledge. So please join us and let's have this conversation around what the challenges are. But as part of that conversation, we will also be hearing from the experts about the resources available to try and mitigate those challenges. So we invite you to that as well. On the 7th of December, we will have a session on safeguarding. I think it was 2 months ago, we worked with Voluntary Action Leads as Africaneness parent team, and we had community leaders from various churches and community groups in and around Leeds. And what we did was to prepare training resources on safeguarding that specifically took into account cultural issues that aren't ordinarily addressed in the mainstream safeguarding trainings. And on the back of that, we're now delivering these trainings and disseminating to various communities. So the next one, we've had one already a couple of weeks ago, which was quite successful. I think we had over 200 people in attendance, and it was delivered in a church, and it was basically safeguarding session for parents in churches. Now, the next one is going to be safeguarding session for parents in African communities. So please spread the word. And of course, join us to try and understand issues around how do we protect children? How do we address the cultural dimensions, which sometimes leads to a tension between child protection and safeguarding in real time? So we look forward to having you there as well. It's going to be holding at the Noel Mount Community Center. And the next thing we have on the 14th of December, and that's the final program for the year, will be the Power of Play. Now, the Power of Play is built around our purposeful parenting training sessions, and it's a free program. It's going to be commencing at 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. And during that program, we'll be doing things like having experts on play therapy come join us and explain to parents how to engage children, but also young people, teenagers, in a way that is playful, but at the same time passes across the message. And there will be a parent coach in residence. We will have discussions, learning, play and fun, family bonding time. And we're even thinking of adding some kind of sales so that people can start doing the Christmas shopping whilst they're with us on the day. So it does promise to be an exciting event, and we hope that you can all join us if you're in Leeds or around Leeds. We have on the screen the QR code for registering, and then the link to the website as well. And we're really grateful to Community Fund for the sponsorship for the program. So with that, I think it brings us very nicely to the social media pages. We've had some questions around volunteering. Thanks to everyone who's interested in volunteering with us. I have put in the chat area the link to Reach Volunteers, which we use to advertise our volunteering opportunities. We also have a section on the Africaneness website, which also deals on volunteering. So please feel free to engage with us on those pages to know more about volunteering opportunities. In addition to that, we're live on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Martin, it would impress you to know that we're not on TikTok yet, but we're getting there. We actually do run some campaigns on TikTok as well. We've just not put it up here, but we're very active and would like for you to join us on social media just to follow our activities, and let's see how we can continue to work together. So thank you so much to everyone for being here. It's been a delight having this session, and I'm hoping that we all feel better empowered to take some action around climate change, to engage the children and young people around us, to do something for the climate, and to help them manage the anxieties around climate and become more resilient in their everyday life. Thank you so much for joining us. I will look forward to seeing you on the 29th and subsequently as well. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Abimbola. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It was great.